to the Coroner's Report, Episode 4 of Miss Maybelline, the Pied Piper, and a Clown Named Hobby. Before we begin, please remember this is a true crime podcast with adult themes. Please be aware, when possible, the actual person's voice is in this podcast. However, several witnesses are deceased. Some chose not to be recorded. Still others agreed for their words to be used, but not their real names. Please remember to like and follow us on all social media platforms. All suspects or persons of interest mentioned are considered innocent until proven guilty in a court of law.
After seeing Evelyn's body, I ran down through the garage downstairs to the back, through the lakefront, and opened the glass sliding door, and it was just all filled with smoke, soot, and water and from running down from above. I was kind of in a panic mode, trying to figure out what was going on. And I opened the back slider and went into the apartment that Danny and I lived in, and there was apparently smoke on that. And I taken my hat on and off a couple of times, trying to get through the crowd and shield my face.
Welcome back to the Coroner's Report. My name is Steve Navoychek. I'm a retired coroner of two of the largest counties in Arkansas and a former state crime lab director. Along with my partners, Tracy Carrington and Carla Bozeman, we've been reviewing old cases. Sometimes these reviews turn up new details that will take your breath away. This is one of those. In the previous 3 episodes, we met Evelyn Williams, an heiress to the Maybelline fortune, and we followed her life from Chicago to Los Angeles to Hot Springs, Arkansas. Along the way, we introduced you to her husbands and ex-husbands, and finally to her hairstylist and wig maker, Danny King, who would become her principal promoter and handler. Evelyn was so pleased with the new Palace Dinner Theater. She was hoping to recoup her financial losses from her disastrous third marriage to Hobby Derrick, but the more she tried, the more money she was losing. She had decided to cut her ties with Danny King and had told him the night of the Palace Dinner Theater opening that he needed to move out of the basement apartment in her house and that his services would no longer be needed. 12 hours later, Evelyn's blistered, scalded body was pulled out of her picturesque home overlooking beautiful Lake Hamilton. Miss Maybelline was dead. I was there. I pronounced her dead.
But her death? Well, that wasn't the end of the story. No, that was just kind of the beginning. Joe Warren, who was the leader of the kids' rock band and owner of Apple Records, he and his girlfriend pulled up to the house during the fire. Remember, they were coming over for band practice, so it was a big shock. I mean, just imagine if you were going over to a friend's house and all of a sudden there's smoke, there's fire, and all these people.
There was not a lot of people there. I would say with the officials and people, I'd say there was never more than 100 people there, and that's not a lot of people in that big area. I don't want to say it's in the middle of nowhere, but it's very private.
After the fire department put out the fire and all the excitement was over, everyone went home. No one could expect what happened next.
A bomb threat later in the evening was reported to Hot Springs Fire Department about 9:40 p.m. Police, fire, and ambulance units rushed to the nightclub but found no evidence of explosives after an extensive search of the premises.
Why in the world would a bomb threat be called into the palace? Was there some shady underworld connection to the fire at the Maybelline Manor? Danny King had hired security to protect Evelyn from her ex-husband Hobby. And it appears, from newspaper reports, he did speak to Hot Springs Police Lieutenant Bob Griffith about threats. But Rick Warren, music director and show producer at the Palace, says he never heard anything about threats until after the fire. The local police investigator had even heard about some of the threats and spoke about it in the paper.
Threats had been made against Miss Williams in the past, as well as against Danny King. There were 2 other young men also reportedly residing at the house at the time of the fire, but Miss Williams had been left alone for an hour or more before the fire began.
The local police wasted no time asking questions.
The thing I remember is that I was at home and the phone rang, and it seemed to me between 9 and 10 o'clock at night, and I answered it, and it was the police, and they told me that they were investigating all this stuff, and asked me to come in, and I said, sure. And I went there, and Clint and Jay were there, and we talked, and I don't remember anything fascinating about the conversations. And it was confusion down there, too, because they were trying to talk to several people. And it was a very short interview, actually, and I just told them what I knew at that point in time, and we weren't there very long. Then they told us to go home.
Danny does admit going back to the crime scene and searching through the rubble, finding $1,500 Evelyn had stashed. There's no accurate time given on when he did this search. Some speculate the bomb threat was called in to distract the fire department long enough for Danny or Steve Wyatt to recover cash from the Maybelline manor.
Now, Steve Wyatt says they did not go into the house until the crime scene was cleared several weeks later. He also claims they found $4,000 stashed in the house. Retired Hot Springs firefighter A.J. Bond, who helped build the house, says it wouldn't have taken long for the basement to be cool enough to enter after the fire.
The basement part, if it didn't get down in the basement, it probably wouldn't be too hot down there to get in. In fact, after the fire was out and they did the salvage and overhaul work fire department, you could go in there and walk around. It wouldn't be that hot because they opened the window and put a fan and suck out the smoke and stuff.
Homeless, exhausted, with all their dreams up in smoke, Danny, Steve Wyatt, and bodyguard Dennis checked into a suite at the swanky historic hotel, the Arlington, which was also known as Al Capone's favorite place for local lodging.
There was a black officer, Hot Springs Police Department, and we registered in one room and then went up 2 floors and registered under a false name. We had an armed bodyguard that Evelyn had hired because of transporting money, and there was a police guard out in the hallway, and a dentist was on the inside, and it was a suite, so there was like a living room.
2 days later, Evelyn's son arrived with his fiancée to help with his mother's estate. The fiancée, Gloria, wrote a letter documenting what happened. The 8-page letter was sent to the Arkansas State Police lead investigator.
On Tuesday, March 7th, about 4 a.m., Mr. Williams observed a letter on the floor in front of his door, room 776 in the Arlington Hotel. I called his room at approximately 6:40 a.m. and asked the hotel operator to make a record of the time of the call. He said hello, but I didn't recognize the voice, and I asked to speak to Danny King. Finally, after much commotion, he put Danny on the phone. I asked him who answered the phone, and he said Stephen Wyatt. He mentioned his bodyguard was there as well, and he had a permit to carry a gun to protect him. I remarked, 3 of you in one room? And he said, yes, it's hell. However, several times during the conversation, he called loudly for cigarettes, and I realized he had a suite of rooms.
Who paid for Danny's room? Rick Warren remembers.
Well, apparently they were running up a bill, trying to charge it to the palace. Finally, I guess the bank, said we're not paying this, and they kicked them out and held their clothes.
The next morning, Sergeant Ray Carnahan of the Arkansas State Police Criminal Investigation Division and Fire Marshal Joe Bob Garner, along with Hot Springs Police Department Lieutenant Bob Griffith, performed a fire scene search of the premises and produced a 10-page report containing burn patterns, measurements, a diagram, log of evidence collected, and an extensive photo log. That information survived in the Arkansas State Police file.
We have a copy of that 10-page report, but no photos were found when we requested information from the State Crime Lab, the Hot Springs Police Department, or the Arkansas State Police. My extensive coroner's report and the many photos I personally took at the scene were never located, but we do have a statement from the newspaper by local police lieutenant Bob Griffith.
2 fires started in the house at about the same time. One began between the wall in the kitchen and the foyer, with the other one breaking out at the base of a bookshelf located in a hall near the bottom floor furnace room. We received at least one report of a car seen speeding away from the home shortly before the blaze was discovered, but a poor description of the vehicle was given. The bomb threat leveled against the dinner theater Thursday night is believed to be a prank and not connected to the fire. Detectives are conducting interviews with several persons and have plans for several more today, but there are no suspects at this time.
Steve Wyatt remembers that car.
There was a car seen by neighbors, a blue Camaro or Trans Am, speeding out at a high rate of speed. And within minutes, the neighbors saw all the smoke.
One of the creepiest parts of the story that's haunted me for years. The story goes that Evelyn was trying to escape the fire when she went to the front door and the doorknob came off in her hand, trapping her in a fiery inferno where she died trying to escape.
The headlines from the local paper the next day screamed that she died with the doorknob in her hand, but that certainly doesn't appear to be the case. The fire report itself says nothing about the doorknob being found in her hand or even anywhere near her body. Jim Hawley, the medic at the scene, has an opinion on where the doorknob was located.
The other thing I wanted to comment on is that they said they found the door handle on the floor inside the front door. Well, that could have been breached by the fire department when they made entry to the front door. She was not near the doorway. I think the kitchen was to the left, and there was like a eating room or something down the hall near the back of the house, some other room, and she was facing away from the kitchen or away from the cooking area, supine. Her head was in a room, I believe, to the right. Her feet were visible down this corridor. She was nowhere near the front door.
Of course, what does near mean? When we measured it out, the foyer measures 10 feet wide by 7.5 feet deep. Evelyn was found about 6 feet from the front door. Near is simply a relative term, and it certainly makes sense how this important bit of information could have been confused. Hot Springs Police Chief Grover Douglas was quoted the next day in the paper.
Law enforcement officials are investigating foul play and suspected arson in connection with the fire, which completely gutted 5 rooms of the 18-room home. Apparently, the fire broke out in 2 places in the house at about the same time. Also, the victim was found near the front door lying on her back. About $75,000 worth of damage was done to the house.
You know, during this time, the crime lab was doing what they called visual autopsies. While I was the coroner, they just really frustrated me when I'd get back something that I knew that I did the same thing at the scene, but this visual autopsy business was something that was not generally accepted in the crime lab world. I was put on a task force with several other people from around the state to look at this, and we made very strong recommendations firing the medical examiner who did this autopsy. Shortly after all of this, I became the director of the crime lab. We made some pretty sweeping changes. Crime labs are supposed to be objective, and they're not supposed to work for any one entity, either the prosecution or the defense, in criminal cases. Arkansas is unique in that it's one of the few states left that still have elected coroners and an appointed medical examiner. Coroners essentially act as investigators in the field for the medical examiner. Now, the other thing about this, and during that time frame, the medical examiner and people in Little Rock in general were viewed sort of as, the messiahs afar. And when state police received word from the crime lab, we sort of considered that as just some message from above. Police were just as bad as everybody else who believed everything that came from the crime lab.
Lieutenant Bob Griffith with the Hot Springs Police Department Detectives Bureau was assigned to the case, and early on he believed the fire was intentionally set.
There's very little doubt that the body is Miss Williams. Myself, along with other investigators, are reasonably certain the fire was a result of arson. Local and state investigators found a doorknob in a portion of the burned floor.
In fact, the hottest part of the fire burned a wall opposite her location in the foyer. This wall was shared with the kitchen, but on the other side of the wall was a cabinet, not the stove, a cabinet. In the police fire scene report, there is no notation of where her body was because no fire or police officials ever saw the body before Jim Hawley dragged her out.
In fact, Steve Wyatt told us that Evelyn stored hard liquor in a cabinet located along that same wall in the kitchen. The house had a full bar downstairs, but that was in Danny's apartment. Evelyn kept liquor in that cabinet upstairs to entertain her guests.
Evelyn was found in a hallway off the foyer to the right. Her feet were in the foyer. The foyer opened at the end of the dining room, but right before the dining room, there was this hallway to the right. She was found face up with her body lying in the hallway toward the bedrooms, just as Holly had said during our interviews. So her body was definitely located 6 feet from the front door in a hallway off the foyer to the right, near yet not right next to the front door. From all this information, we can reasonably say the doorknob was found on the floor in the foyer and not in Miss Maybelline's hand. Angie Sheets remembers the doorknob.
I believe Danae told me about the door handle had come off in her hand. And he shared with me when he got home, I mean, there she was and how it must have I can't even imagine how devastating it was for him.
I'm starting to think all this nonsense of her dying with the doorknob in her hand started with the melodramatic Danny King. And this security measure, that sounds more like horseshit to me.
If you like the Coroner's Report and the programming we're providing, please remember to like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts so we can keep providing quality programming. Like and subscribe today.
Lieutenant Bob Griffith investigated that issue and discovered it really was not an amateur attempt at security.
We puzzled at first over the security modification made to the front door, which caused the doorknob to come off from the inside. Some thought Miss Williams may have tried to escape to the front door, but was overcome by smoke and then the doorknob came off. Some of the other occupants of the house told us it was a security measure, but that didn't make no sense. I contacted the prior owner of the house, who also said the doorknob would come off from the inside.
Steve Wyatt was haunted for a long time by that part of the story.
You know what's always bothered me all these years? She was found by the main front door with the doorknob laying next to her. And she had tried to go out the front door. And that front door had this type of doorknob that you could lock the door and then push the doorknob in and pull it out so it actually come out. And the door could not be unlocked, even from the outside with a key. It was this type of security. And it was wore out. She could never operate it. Every time she tried to use it, the doorknob would come off in her hand. And that was one of the things that she was on me about getting fixed. To this day, it still bothers me that I didn't prioritize that and immediately go down and replace that doorknob. And if I had, she would never have died the way she did.
So if anything, the smoking doorknob, so to speak, was not found in her hand and was not used to trap her in a burning building. It was simply a small maintenance issue that never was corrected prior to the fire.
And then there were the wigs.
Ah, the wigs.
The story goes that as the fire department pulled up, there were wigs on styrofoam wig heads all lined up neatly in a row on the front lawn. Danny's art. After all, he was the internationally known Canadian wig maker from a generational wig-making family, right? That's how he was marketed in Texas and then again in California before relocating to Arkansas just 2 years before.
And you established through his genealogy that there were never any wig makers in his family lineage, right?
Correct. In fact, going back 3 generations, there's no ancestor making a living with wigs or even living in Canada. All simply smoke and mirrors and marketing. Jim Hawley ate some smoke that day as he was being treated at the scene before taking a ride in his own ambulance to the hospital, but he remembers.
On the front lawn, it was really weird. It was like mannequin heads, and there were wigs strewn on the front lawn when we got there, which was kind of odd. They didn't look like they were neatly lined up.
When we started this, I expected the story of the doorknob in her hand to be true, but the story of the wigs and the styrofoam heads, that had to be some kind of urban legend. I was wrong. It was exactly the opposite. The doorknob may not have been in her hand, but the wigs, well, they were there.
I'm fairly certain no one ran into a burning house to save a bunch of wigs and styrofoam heads.
And it doesn't seem likely that a synthetic wig or styrofoam head could possibly be near a fire. We even checked the humidity level from the National Weather Service for that day. No one's ever going to put a wig outside in 82% humidity to air out because that would just cause frizz.
You know, I really don't remember much about the wigs because I was focused on the death scene, of course, and making sure that my medic was okay. My coroner's assistant, who was with me that day, LaJuan Hill, vividly remembers the wigs, and she remembers that I took dozens of photographs and that she took pages and pages of notes, none of which can be found at the coroner's office today. But even days later, Evelyn's son remembered seeing several wigs at the house outside the front door. He arrived from California 2 days after the fire, and they were still on the lawn near the front door behind the police tape.
According to the Hot Springs Police Department, 6 days after the fire took Evelyn's life, the Arkansas State Police Major Case Squad is assisting local law enforcement in the investigation because of the number of people involved in the case and an overload of cases.
Retired Arkansas State Police investigator David Hendershot remembers the case well. He was assigned to assist lead investigator Sergeant Mike Fletcher in the investigation.
What I think the best of my recollection is that it had been done 5 days after the fact. The crime scene was screwed up. The fire department had been in there and everybody else. I think the family, her kids, called the state police and had these conspiracy theories that maybe Danny did it or the Dixie Mafia and all this other kind of crap, and they wanted us to look into it because they didn't trust the local police to do it right.
The Arkansas State Police interviewed the State Crime Lab medical examiner, whose investigation was very brief.
We have examined the charred remains of the body received from Hot Springs, Arkansas, and find it the following results. There is no alcohol content in the body. The body is of a white female in the middle of her upper 70s. The dental work is worn. There is no evidence of any foul play, such as deep wounds, cuts, or so forth. The cause of death is smoke inhalation.
Her dental work was worn? Evelyn didn't have dental work. She did have dentures, and they were specially made dentures that helped fill out her cheeks because of her age and provided her her signature radiant smile. That was just the beginning of the strange stuff.
By 1978, carpenter A.J. Bond, who worked for the builder of the house, had been with the fire department for 12 years. While he didn't work the fire, he had heard stories for years from his fellow firefighters, and he remembered nearly all of them.
At the time that house burned, and everybody's suspicion that some of them set it on fire.
There were plenty of theories on the cause of the fire. The most humorous to me might just be the chicken in the pot on the stove. According to Danny King, the frozen chicken went into the pot on the stove at approximately 10:30 a.m. and boiled down, starting a massive inferno by 4 p.m. Now, this was only about an hour after Jay Lambert left the house, yet Jay didn't ever report the smell of burning chicken.
So I'm no scientist, but I know how to boil a chicken, and it sure doesn't take 6 hours. The crime scene search report done the next day by fire investigators clearly describes the chicken that Danny said was placed on the stove to stew at about 10:30 in the morning. It reads, on the back right burner of the cook stove, a cooking pot has melted down and had run around the coils of the burner. On the left front burner was a pot which contained pieces of meat which is believed to be chicken. The chicken inside the pot was not charred. It was in a medium well stage. So, how could a stewing chicken survive in a raging inferno and not be charred? The pot had melted away. And how could a chicken stewing for 6 hours still just be cooked to medium well? Something's not adding up.
So that's what happened, but that doesn't really tell us much of anything now, does it? It's time to boil down the cabbage and see what floats to the top. Let's start with an easy question. What caused the fire? Was it an accident? Was it intentional? Easy questions, right? So when in doubt, call in an expert, and that's just what we did.
John Flasterer, 23 years with the North Little Rock Fire Department. So about 20 of that was spent as a paramedic. About the same was spent as a fire investigator. 12 was spent in the fire marshal's office as a fire investigator. I have a bachelor's degree in public safety.
There were and still are so many questions about this case. One of the big questions was the location and condition of Evelyn's body inside the home.
Typically in a fire, if you succumb to smoke, probably fall to their knees and then face down. You're gonna try to get below the smoke. When we found people, they were face down. Now, that's how people fall, but I can't say that couldn't happen. If somebody did knock her in the head or whatever, that, typically that's the way you would probably lay somebody down.
Jim Hawley and I both remember that she was more scalded than burned, and that information might be important in figuring out what happened in that damn house.
A fire will burn itself until it can't burn itself anymore, until it runs out of oxygen. And it starts to burn itself out. And then if a window punctures or it burns itself through the roof, it's replenished with more oxygen and then burns more freely. So this fire had to be burning for a period of time, more than an hour before the alarm was called in by neighbors. I mean, the extent was a lot of the house had been involved.
John Flasterer also agrees that this fire didn't just start 5 minutes before the first call for help came in at 4 p.m.
But if she's got these super big vaulted ceilings, she's got time to get out. It would take a while for that smoke to build up. We refer to a house as a box, and it pressurizes. So the pressure builds up, and it like I say, it pushes that smoke down until the smoke basically pushes you down. So this smoke would have to bank down until it reaches her. She would have more time than a typical person to get out.
Now remember, Jay Lambert told police in his statement that he left the house at 2:45 and he heard but didn't see anyone moving around in the kitchen. Arkansas State Police investigator David Hendershot remembers all the different theories.
Danny normally took care of her and took care of the meals and did things for her and all this, but he got so wrapped up in that nightclub that he conned her out of. I honestly believe, and it was an accident. I understand that the arson investigator says that the chicken wasn't burnt, so it couldn't have started the fire. Well, from what I read in that report, supposedly she had put a chicken on a pot to boil, to thaw it out. If you just throw that chicken in a pot of water and boil for a while, all that fat is rendered out. Well, when the water starts boiling, if it starts foaming up, it's going to go over, and the fat's going to be the first thing that hits the fire. When it catches on, by the time she realized something was going wrong, the whole top of that stove would have been on fire, and there would have been fire going up the walls. But I didn't have access to the fire department report or none of that. I didn't know half what you know.
Retired Hot Springs fireman A.J. Bond, who built the kitchen cabinets in the house, has other ideas of what caused the fire.
If it would have been a chicken boiling, she would have smelled it. I wasn't out there. I didn't see it. Everybody that I talked to was real suspicious that it was set on fire intentionally. I never heard boiling water setting nothing on fire.
Medic Jim Hawley, who crawled in and dragged Evelyn's body out, says he doesn't think it was the chicken.
Well, not unless the chicken was still alive, caught fire, and ran around the house.
Wigs, flaming chickens of death, stepfathers marrying daughters, geez. In the fire report, the stove was electric with a coil. When in doubt, call an electrician, and that's what we did. Meet Jeff McCann. He's a master electrician with Wise Buck Electric in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, and that means he knows his stuff.
The maximum temperature on a stove coil is around 550 degrees Fahrenheit, and then the aluminum is like 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit to actually melt, if not more than that. No electric coil is going to get that hot. The stove is ran in one circuit. It's got its own circuit. No matter how old the house is, they've always had their own circuit. It's a big service for your house. It's the biggest service usually in your house. It's usually a 40 or 50 amp circuit, depending on the size of it. It's 3 wires that go to it. Nowadays, there's 4 wires that go to it, but back then it was probably just 3. And I still don't see how it would backfeed and cause fires in the other parts of the house. That's unlike any electrical fire I've heard of. That's typically not how it goes. You get a hot spot, and then the whole house burns down from that hot spot or something like that. Didn't ground the system properly or to cause problems throughout the rest of the house. It just don't make sense to me.
Immediately after the fire, the rumors of faulty wiring or faulty heating ducts were fueled by Danny himself. Gloria Rosen, who was in town 2 days after the fire and would later marry Evelyn's son, informed the investigators.
Danny made a special point of telling me of all the faulty wiring.
In Gloria's letter, she says Danny also blamed faulty heater ducts as the cause of the fire.
Carpenter and retired firefighter A.J. Bond, along with the master electrician Jeff McCann, believe the wiring in the house wasn't the problem. The house, as you know, was built in the mid-'60s and was inside the city limits.
They had a licensed plumber and electrician do it. I don't remember who it was, but they always utilized an electrician and plumber too in their houses.
Even in the mid 60s, I think they came out like 62 or 64, where it was code, where it was mandatory. So if it was code and built in the city limits, then yes, it probably had a 3-wire setup with a ground.
Danny also mentioned to Gloria and others that the ductwork was faulty. However, there was no damage to the basement furnace room or the furnace itself. McCann thinks differently.
Faulty ductwork. I mean, even then, let's say if it is faulty ductwork, how is that going to cause a fire? Even if you got your heat turned all the way up, it's still blowing through there about 70, 75 degrees, if not 80. Faulty ductwork? I don't see faulty ductwork doing it.
John Flaster, our fire expert, found the idea that Danny was saying the cause was electrical is almost laughable.
Just the fact that he wouldn't have any idea that happened. I mean, he would have no idea. Nobody would know that unless an electrical expert was hired. I would have to bring somebody in, and like electricians, heat and air guys who were very good at it. And we might start an initial investigation, and if we found some things that were suspicious, then we would have to bring in engineers, So to bring that up, you just have to laugh that off.
So up next is the idea of arson. But how do you prove, after all these years, what happened? We know there is heavy fire damage in the foyer and in the living room. But the most severe damage from the fire was in the kitchen, but not where you would expect. The crime scene report reads, along the north wall of the kitchen was a wooden storage area that had severe heat damage and was burned away. The north wall? Why, that's opposite of the stove, and it was a cupboard where Evelyn stored liquor, according to Steve Wyatt.
Yet Holly, the medic that went into the house during the fire, firmly believes it may have been intentionally set. And remember, Holly was a trained firefighter as well as a paramedic.
Well, it had been burning a while. I mean, you don't go from 0 to 10 in a very quick time. It looked like it had been burning for a while. And anytime you get a fire that has been, that appears to be started in different places in a structure, you always have to think about, arson. And from every report that Steve had sent me, it said they acknowledged the fact that there were several points of origin from the fire itself. That's always troublesome to see that.
John Flasterer, who is a very well-educated arson investigator and a retired battalion chief from the North Little Rock Fire Department, went back to the reference materials to easily prove this fire was intentionally set.
NFPA, which is National Fire Protection Association, covers everything fire-related, from, safety to the way buildings are built to fire investigations. If you can think of it, they cover it. It's the Bible. Chapter 23 specifically, in fact, it's called incendiary fires. So the third paragraph in it is called multiple fire, an arson fire. It looks like it was a set fire. It seemed that there were multiple ignition points, minimum of 3 separate ignition points in the home. It's pretty obvious that it wasn't a kitchen fire. The chicken wasn't burned. If it's a cooking fire, one thing for sure is the food in the pot is going to burn. It's going to burn, it's going to char and pretty much burn to nothing.
Of course, arson is one of the hardest crimes to prove there is. You just about got to see somebody set it on fire, and somebody got to see you see them set it on fire.
So if this wasn't an accidental fire and was an intentional arson, who did it? Who had something to gain from the death of the Maybelline Queen?
Arkansas State Police investigator David Hendershot was assigned to assist the lead investigator. Hendershot Mirandized and questioned Stephen Wayne Wyatt. The interview was expected to be a long one, and it was recorded. Gary Miller with the Hot Springs Police Department was to transcribe the recording, and copies were supposed to be placed in the state police file. The transcription was never done. Wyatt remembers being polygraphed and believes that Jay Lambert was polygraphed as well. Danny had agreed to a polygraph, but none of those records survived in the file.
During the interview of Stephen Wyatt, it was observed by this investigator and Sergeant Gary Miller with the Hot Springs City Police Department that Mr. Stephen Wyatt was wearing a gray-colored cloth cowboy hat and that this hat contained smudges of soot and ash on the brim. At this time, this investigator asked him if he touched anything at the scene of the fire or Mrs. Williams' body, and he stated that he did not. At this time, I asked him if he would release his hat to have it analyzed, and he advised that he would.
Arkansas State Police investigator Hendershot took Wyatt's hat, his shirt, his boots, and jeans into evidence. During our interviews, Steve Wyatt was adamant he did not enter the house until the crime scene had been released and the judge had given the okay for them to return to gather their belongings. That happened almost 3 weeks after the fire. Yet in a follow-up interview, Steve Wyatt told us a slightly different version of how soot might have gotten on his cowboy hat.
Yeah, after seeing Evelyn's body, and I ran down through the garage downstairs to the back, to the lakefront, and opened the glass sliding door, and it was just all filled with smoke, soot, and water from running down from above. I was kind of in a panic mode, trying to figure out what was going on. And I opened the back slider that went into the apartment that Danny and I lived in, and there was apparently smoke on that. And I'd taken my hat on and off a couple of times, trying to get through the crowd and shield my face.
This concludes the 4th episode in the Miss Maybelline, the Pied Piper, and a Clown Named Hobby series. Our team, well, we're still looking for answers. If you have information you'd like to share, please reach out to us on our website at coronersreport.net or on any social media platform at The Coroner's Report. And don't forget to subscribe to our podcast. This case can still be solved, but we need your help. Thanks go out to all who made this podcast possible, including Evelyn's granddaughter, Sherry Williams, who sat for hours of interviews and provided the voice to her grandmother's words. We would also like to thank Joe Warren, AJ Boyd, Steve Wyatt, Rick Warren, Jim Hawley, Angie Sheets, David Hendershot, John Flasterer, and Jeff McCann for allowing us to share their memories and their expertise. Special thanks to voice actors J.D. West, Alan Prather, and Amy Oliver Barnes. Additional information about this story may be found in the following books: The Maybelline Story and the Spirited Family Dynasty Behind It, written by Evelyn's granddaughter, Sherry Williams, and The Maybelline Prince, written by Danae Montague King.